This is part 2 of our 2-day transit through the Panama Canal. When we cleared the Atlantic locks the night before, we made a left turn and went about 3/4 of a mile to a mooring ball where we tied up with Dragonfly, right near a big service dock for all the tugboats. Our canal transit advisors arrived at 9 o'clock. Dragonfly was the first to let go of the mooring ball, and we followed shortly thereafter. As we headed south down the lake, we passed ships of all different shapes and sizes. The most impressive were the container ships, piled high with 40-foot containers, numbering as many as 700 on their decks. The kids and Jake set up deck chairs on top of the cabin and just sat back and took in the show. The only thing missing from that scene, a popcorn vendor and somebody selling ice-cold drinks. The number of shipping containers going across the canal and being loaded on either side was mind-boggling, and we wondered, what's inside them? Where's it going? Who's it for? The last 13 kilometers of the transit is the Culebra Cut, a man-made waterway cut through steep mountain terrain to get to a point where they could build the locks. And speaking of locks, it was once again time to wrap up with Dragonfly as we approached the Pedro Miguel lock, the first of the 3 on the Pacific side of the canal. Because of our fast transit across the lake, we were slightly ahead of schedule. So instead of having to wrap up with Dragonfly while we were moving, this time we tied Fearless up to the pier and Dragonfly was able to wrap up to us while we were stationary. Our canal advisors informed us that Bow Saga, the ship that had gone through the locks on the Atlantic side with us the night before, was also scheduled to go down with us into the Pacific. So we had to wait for her to catch up as well. So we threw the lines over and waited for about 15 or 20 minutes for Bow Saga to get into position.
I don't know if you can see it in the video, but there is a little tiny rowboat, no joke rowboat, and they are taking lines out to this big ship. Unbelievable.
Rowboats have been bringing messenger lines out to ships since the canal opened. Even with modern inventions like outboard motors and diesel engines, it's still the most reliable and consistent way to ensure that those messenger lines get to the ship at that critical moment as they're entering the locks. Once the ship in front of us had cleared out, they closed the lock doors, filled it up, and then opened the gates on our side to let us in. The kids took my quip about not having a vendor selling snacks and cold drinks to heart, so they filled up the line bag on the back of the mast with snacks that they could easily grab and wouldn't have to leave their perch on top of the cabin. As you can see from this real-time footage of us moving into position inside the Pedro Miguel locks, we are going very slowly. And this is done for a couple of reasons, but first and foremost, we can only go as fast as our line walkers on shore. The overarching reason, of course, is safety. The last thing they want is an accident inside the locks that would prevent traffic from flowing. Our canal advisor, Harold, pictured here, stood on the bow and directed Steve and me as we maneuvered the boats into the locks. As you recall, we had gone up the Atlantic side locks with Bow Saga in front of us, but this time we were going down with her behind us. We asked Harold about this, and he told us that all small boats transiting the canal are scheduled in this way. This makes perfect sense when you think about it. On the way up, they were filling the lock, and therefore when Bow Saga moved out of the lock in front of us, with her propeller turning, there was a lot of water under the keel to absorb some of those hydrodynamic forces. It didn't really affect us that much, although we did feel the wash a little bit. On the way down, the exact opposite would be true. Because there would be so much less water under Bow Saga's keel, and her propeller. When that propeller started turning, that water would create hydrodynamic forces that would be very dangerous for us. The ride down was very smooth, much different than the ride up. The water was simply draining out, not being pumped in. You'll notice as we prepare to exit the Pedro Miguel locks, 2 sets of lock doors are opening instead of 1. On the Atlantic side, there was just 1 set of lock doors. We wondered why this was, so we asked our canal advisor, and I did a little research on it online. What I learned is that the extra gates at the Pedro Miguel and Miraflores locks on the Pacific side were put there as precautions to protect from damage that could allow the lake water to escape and flow out to sea. He also pointed out these old rollers, and we can see here are these guides for these gigantic steel doors that used to be raised or lowered by big chains in the event of an emergency or in the event of an attack. Harold also told us the double doors were there as a mitigation against submarine attacks on the Pacific side, specifically from the rising threat of Japanese submarines in the early part of the 20th century. It's about a mile between the two locks on the Pacific side, the Pedro Miguel lock and then the two Miraflores locks. So, to make things easier, we just stayed rafted up with Dragonfly as we transited across the 1 mile long Miraflores Lake. Our transit was through the original lock system, which officially opened on August 15, 1914. Just off to our right and out of view are a new set of locks that opened in 2016. These can now handle ships that are about 1.5 times the previous Panamax size and can carry over twice as much cargo. Check out this cool screenshot captured from the webcam by my brother watching us live in Massachusetts as we entered the Miraflores locks. You can see what Panamax means by looking at our friend Balsaga. There just simply is not a lot of room on either side of her hull. The size limitations associated with Panamax ships becomes even more dramatic when they're lowered down inside the lock wells. As we entered the Miraflores locks, the crew seemed pretty relaxed. It had been a long day, and by this point, everybody was eager to get to the Pacific Ocean. This was the moment. We were approaching the last lock before getting lowered into the Pacific Ocean. It seemed at this point like we had gone through a portal, like we were entering a different world. One of the things we noticed going through Gatun Lake and the locks was that both of our boats sat lower on the waterline due to the lack of salinity in the water.
We're going to go from halfway sunk to floating again.
Like good boat kids, Gav, Lex, Tugi, and Narai all stationed themselves up in the bow to see if they could detect any change in the waterline level. These are the experiential learning opportunities that make sailing so much fun for kids. Unfortunately, it wasn't as dramatic as we thought it would be. What was cool, though, was to see where the water from the lakes emptying from the locks collided with the Pacific Ocean in a very clear demarcation of saltwater and fresh. We separated from Dragonfly after we exited the last lock and headed towards the Bridge of the Americas, built by the United States between 1959 and 1962. We motored the last few miles down the channel, under the Bridge of the Americas, and then picked up a mooring ball at Balboa Yacht Club. There, we offloaded our line handlers, our rented fenders, rented dock lines, then kicked back with a bottle of Veuve Clicquot to celebrate our successful transit through the Panama Canal. We were so happy that our friend Jake could join us on this transit, and we thanked Dragonfly for sharing some of their video with us.